Welcome back. Let's get this party started. If you recall from last week, I left off with a system of turbojank pumping out a crucible full of all sorts of mystery products needed to make a small quantity of void metal. That process is still going on and will be going on for quite some time, so I need to find things to occupy mine with. Since I'm also still trying to push for IV, this is not particularly difficult, and my first time-wasting task is stocking up my circuit assemblers with the items they need to turn my nano-circuit thingies into higher-tier nano-circuit thingies. I don't know, I kind of stopped paying attention to the names past a certain point. I already had the inductors prepped and ready to go, but apparently I forgot to get the RAM chips going, so I have to wait a bit while my system downloads those. With my contractually obligated amount of multitasking out of the way, let's do something more interesting. Like make another over-engineered, highly specific, and soon-to-be entirely ignored mob farm. In addition to being a requirement for crafting Void Putty, and also just casually letting you create your own universes, stabilized rifts can also be fed other items to do interesting things. One of these interesting things happens to be spawning wisps when fed Salus Mundus. I imagine the expectation of the mod author was that you would only want to feed a small amount of Salus Mundus into the rift, producing a manageable quantity of wisps to make ethereal essence farming for, like, the 2 recipes that normally require it. The mod author even goes so far as to recommend that incautious thaumaturges might find themselves overwhelmed because of the variability of the spawn rate. I wouldn't categorize myself as incautious so much as I would simply say that I'm indifferent, but once you translate past the magitechno twaddle, this basically just says goose around and find out, which is something I'm actually against in this case. I would never be so callous as to intentionally abuse unbalanced game mechanics. Yeah, okay, so here is the wisp farm I built entirely around abusing game mechanics like this. It's pretty simple. Dispenser go click, Salus Mundus go up, wisps go ah! I get rich. Your guess is as good as mine as to why these things are all infernal, but that's New Horizons for you, so we'll take it. If I ever need more than a few stacks of essence, I'm going to have to filter out the infernal drops, but whatever. This farm is good enough for what I need it to do. I'm as much of a fan of making random mob farms as the next bird, but if you've been watching my videos, you probably know that there's almost always a very good reason for everything I do, and this is no exception. You see, mana enchanting at the scale I need to be able to handle has a little bit of an issue inherent to the process. That issue is that it takes a long stinking time, and you can't world accelerate a mana enchanter. For the sake of clarification, you can, it just doesn't really help. The enchanted book detection and ending animations can be accelerated, but those only take a few seconds and don't scale with a level of enchantment. The real time sink is the mana collection part. That absolutely scales with the enchantment level, and its completion rate is directly linked to how fast you can feed the thing mana, which is entirely independent of how many times the structure itself ticks over. There doesn't seem to be a cap on how much mana a spark can accept or transmit in total, but there is very much a cap on how much it can transmit from another spark, which is how any bulk mana transportation has to be handled. As with most things that I encounter, this is usually not a problem for normal playthroughs. The amount of mana that a spark can move is massively overscaled compared to the rest of the mod, and I have never encountered a situation where I need to fill a mana pool faster than a spark could empty it. Until now. Thankfully, we have a solution. It's my pleasure to introduce you to the Spark Augmentation Mechanism, or SPAM, for short. This sucker circumvents the mana output problems that come from throttled one-to-one spark interactions by just doing more of it. Why concern yourself with the mana output of a single puny spark when you could instead feed the output of 64 sparks into a mana enchanter instead? Frame rate, and mana system strong enough to justify the thing's existence, not included. Truly, my engineering genius respects no limits, including those of my CPU's clock speed. Of course, the whole system hinges on having mana production systems strong enough to justify its existence, so let's get started on that. The first step is making a small amount of void metal as a proof of concept. I mean, 1,000 is probably enough, but maybe just to be sure... better add an extra 0 onto that number. Wouldn't want to run out during testing. Then, if my understanding of the mechanic is correct, I should just be able to lob a stack into a rift, click on the rift with my wand, and yep, there we go. Out comes a stack of void putty. Now, with a little Gregtechification put on for extra flavor, I should, in theory, be able to take all of this, lob it all into here, hop up here, and then start clicking. Yes, this seems exactly like what the mod authors intended, I'm sure. And there we go, a casual 10,000 void putty ready to rumble. Next problem, mana tide bellows don't actually increase the speed at which mana will feed into a pool from a dropped item. I thought they did, but I tried it and they didn't, so apparently it's a one-way interaction. This means that now my mana production rate is limited by how quickly mana can be pulled out of items, and by sheer coincidence, dropping more items means more mana production. Gee whiz, I sure wonder what I'm going to do with that bit of information. So, I may have discovered a tiny little problem with this plan. You see, I sort of just assumed that the amount of mana in a ring was directly linked with the durability of the ring. It turns out that this is not the case. While the damage indicator on the ring does reflect the amount of mana in the ring, it is not intrinsically linked to it, which is to say that when I repair a ring with void putty, that's a bit like writing full on a sticky note and then putting it on your car's gas tank. Like, sure, the tank says it's full, but when you actually try and run your car with it, you end up getting nowhere. Which means that the one time I didn't do a full process small scale test, I got bitten in the butt for it, and now have about 11,000 void putty, an entire stabilized dimensional rift, and a full spam system that I'm going to need to find a use for. Oh. And no mana, which was the whole point of all of this. Well, rats. Back to the drawing board. I need roughly 32,000 pools of mana. In my inventory are all the mana generating flowers in the game. Let's see what we're working with here by first eliminating all of the uncraftable, non-functional, or clearly too inefficient options, and then exhaustively testing the rest. In addition to the ones I already mentioned are unusable, I add begonias and narcolimnus to the list. Begonias, since the best drone I can feed them only nets me around 400 mana each, and narcolimnus because they just seem to be straight up broken and don't eat slimes at all regardless of how they're spawned, which I suspect has to do with special mobs being a thing, but fundamentally this is not a problem I can solve, so those two are still disqualified. The Rafflesia, I am going to mispronounce many of these flowers as names, just live with it. The Rafflesia produces 2100 mana by eating other Botania flowers and has a screamingly fast cooldown. The only problem is that I would need 15 million Botania flowers to feed it, not a chance, disqualified. The Spectralus produces 1200 mana by consuming wool, but only if you feed it the specific color of wool that it wants, and the color it wants changes every time you feed it. This is simple to automate because the order it eats wool in is always the same. So if I could somehow collect and dye 26 million wool blocks and feed them at a rate of 1 per second, these would produce the mana I need in about 306 Spectralus days of processing. Like the Gormarillus, Spectrals eat any wool that don't match their desired type and don't give mana for it, so I would need some massive infrastructure to make them work, but it would not be impossible. Of course, that ignores the question of whether or not I can actually get that much dyed wool. Dyeing the wool would need 240,000 of each color of dye, which could get really, really ugly to make, but it is possible. That amount of wool is entirely unreasonable to harvest conventionally, but you can convert string into the wool, and, seeing as the whole point of this project is over-enchanting, it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility that I could just stack up a few thousand levels of looting swords in a general mob farm area and turn them loose on a spider production system. Depressingly, this is the first tractable option at my disposal, so I will set them aside, but I'm not super interested in them because of what I would have to do to get the wool. Looting doesn't really scale string drops all that quickly, so I would need a lot of spider farms to make this work. Munchdews produce 160 mana per leaf block they consume, and consume about 4 blocks a second, in doing so requiring about 578 Munchdew days of processing to get the mana I need. I would have to supply the 4.2 million oak saplings worth of leaf blocks directly to ensure a consistent consumption rate and no interruptions, but Ender IO tree farms can harvest trees with shears to get those. That'll go on the maybe list. The hardest part here would be getting the saplings, and if I could solve that problem, these are probably a better option than spectrals. Dandelions are shockingly a solid no. They are too slow, produce too little mana, and need way more space than I'm willing to provide. Which is ironic given that they're supposed to be the endgame flower and are supposed to be balanced for that role. Gourmies, short for Gormarillus, are my first solid option. Vegetable soup seems to produce a hair over 4,000 mana each after diminishing return finishes kicking in on the flowers, which is the first number I've seen that makes me even marginally optimistic about this being possible. Assuming 5 seconds per soup, with my Gaia mana spreaders extracting the mana as fast as possible, and Gourmies would only require 8 million soup and 462 days of processing. Even better, I can switch from making soup to making stuffed eggplants, which require less crafting automation and produce the same amount of mana. Rosa Arcana consume experience at a rate of 50 mana per point. Zombies are currently giving me about 80 points per death, so that means I would only need a mere 80 million of them to die to give me the 14,200 levels of XP needed to produce my mana. The problem with that being that even at a optimistic 10 zombies killed per second and assuming a 100% XP pickup efficiency, I would still need to wait 92 days to produce that much XP. I experimented a bit with other sources, but nothing I found was particularly inspiring, and I concluded that I would need an entirely new, yet undiscovered XP generation paradigm before I could use the things. Disqualified, but conditional on my XP generation tech not experiencing another breakthrough. Entropinium produce 6,500 mana from an exploding TNT entity. Regular TNT is kind of expensive, but powder barrels also spawn TNT entities when broken, so I could use those instead. The 610 barrels of logs for planks might be a bit of an ask, though, as would the 462 LV assembler days of processing needed to make the planks. It is a decent option, if only because it turns the problem from a Britannia one into a Gregtech one, and Gregtech tends to scale better, but even with a stack of assemblers running non-stop, this would take almost a week. I will put it down as a maybe, but I think I'd prefer Gourmies. Kikamurus also seem like a strong contender on par with the Gormarillus. They produce 12,600 mana per cake in 16 seconds, which is about 470 Keck days of processing. Yeah, we're going to have some really weird unit analysis, just ignore it. More importantly, they can eat Pam's Harvestcraft cakes in addition to the vanilla kind. Most of the cakes are really not super bulk producible given how obnoxious it would be to scale up their ingredient production, but Pineapple Upside Down Cake only needs pineapples, walnuts, cherries, and dough, and all of those can be cranked out fast enough to craft the 2.5 million cakes that would be required. My final potential option is the Thermalily. They consume a lava block to produce 18,000 mana, requiring only about 1.8 million buckets of the stuff. The problem with them is that they do this over 45 seconds with an additional 5-minute cooldown period after the fact, meaning that they have a ridiculously large 7,098 Thermalily day processing timeline, which would only shorten to 925 Thermalily days if I was able to break and replace them to reset that cooldown, which would in the process introduce far more complexities that I'd have to work around. They are a option, especially given how cheap lava would be to produce at that scale, but they don't really have any advantage over Gormarillus or Kekimurus, and I would need to spam out a lot more of them to get my mana in a reasonable time frame. And yeah, that's it. Everything else was either so inefficient that even with entire chunks of them, they would require thousands of hours of playtime, or enormous, massive chunk gobbling infrastructure that would slow down my computer and crash the game, or both. Ironically, if Endoflames could have been made to work, I would only need to burn about 3 million blocks of charcoal, which is not all that unreasonable of an ask and is trivial to automate. So, as I see it, this once again proves that Endoflame spam is truly the superior strategy, but isn't of much help. After reviewing all of my options, the Gormorillus came out fairly strongly ahead, beating the Keck flower by virtue of having faster mana production potential and a cheaper recipe. That said, they also require a fair bit more infrastructure to work effectively, so my work queue just got a whole lot longer. My first step is unplugging the whole, now useless, void metal production system and emptying the crucible of useful materials. I've already got the materials in the crucible, so I may as well use them, right? Maybe an extra 7,000 void metal will come in useful at some point. I also switch my food manufacturing to produce stuffed eggplant, since that's just an objectively more efficient food source to be using. The next step is automating rune production. Normally I wouldn't bother, but normally I am also not trying to engineer the logistics needed to handle a mere 4 stacks of Gormorillus producing mana all at once. The real limiting factor for Gormies is not their production speed, it's how quickly I can drain the mana away from them, and the most efficient way of doing this is locked behind ludicrous voltage tier processing and access to Alfheim, neither of which are particularly accessible. Conveniently, the next most efficient way is well within my ability to produce, and involves just slapping a potency lens onto a regular mana spreader, and making sure that the spreader empties itself before the flower starts voiding mana. Of course, doing that requires several hundreds of runes, and I can't be bothered to make them by hand, hence why I have an incredibly ugly water slide hovering over my runic crafting table. After that nightmare finishes running, I need to collect some more material. Like, a lot of materials. Thus begins the Herculean task of crafting 256 floating Gormorillus. Vasky is something of a coding genius, and puts in actual crafting shortcuts to mitigate the repetitive stress injury risk, so this is one of the rare things that is not blindingly painful to do in bulk. It's just deafening. Designing the mana logistics to handle this many Gormies is the tricky part, because there's a bunch of different requirements I have to consider for the design. First, and the most important, every spark in the system has to be within 12 blocks of the mana enchanter, otherwise I'm going to have to do some incredible nonsense. Since I also want 1 spreader per flower, and the spreaders need to be placed directly next to the mana pool for maximum throughput, those requirements combined means that there are some very real space constraints that I have to work with here. To complicate things more, Gormies have a pickup range of a 3-block cube centered on the flower, which also limits how tightly I can pack them without risking them stealing each other's food, which they will do. Because of their tendency to eat anything in the general vicinity, regardless of whether or not they just ate, they need to have their own food dispensed individually, meaning that I also need individually supplied and redstone signal droppers for each flower. Mana-generating flowers also only wirelessly transmit their mana to a linked spreader within a 6-block range, so the flower has to respect that requirement too. Ideally, I would additionally want this setup to not look like dog water, but given the laundry list of engineering requirements, I have to deal with what I can get here. I don't quite know what design I'm gonna do with this yet, but I will tell you one thing. It's gonna be big, so I have to move my mana enchanter somewhere with a little more space first. The first part of my plan design sees me building mana transfer pylons out of 8 sparked mana pools and 32 mana spreaders, each equipped with a potency focus, and with the mana spreaders all configured to be looking at the pool closest to them. This satisfies the first 2 requirements, since all 64 of the sparks from the 4 mana transfer pylons' pools' stacks are within the range of the enchanter. Man, I love English. And the spreaders are all touching the side of the mana pool. Of course, this also requires me to individually place redirect and lens 256 mana spreaders, but, who's telling? And I have to tear it all out and start over again, because I can't do math and built the whole thing too close to the Goose Juice sippy cup. This time, I will do it with clearer markings on the floor. Good job, me. Right, there we go. Let's try this again. Transfer pylons go up, no problems. Sparks report clear connectivity, which you can check by clicking on the spark that you want to transmit to. So I lens everything up and move on. The next step is to add the mana generation pylons. These pylons are made of alternating rows of Gormies and dispensers, and a layer of cobblestone spacer to keep it all nice and separated. with an item conduit in the center to resupply all the dispensers. Because of how tight the spacing requirements are with the transfer pylon and how fiddly all of the interlinkages have to be, I have to be careful to link Gormies up with their correct spreader and make sure all of the things get wrenched into the right positions. But once that's dealt with, it's not so bad. After that, I do the other side. It's the same idea, the only difference is that the Gormies are linked up to spreaders one block above their current Y level, so I can make sure that I maintain the 1 spreader to Gormie ratio, while still keeping everything compact. With the transference and generation pylons constructed, I then just lay down a bunch of cobble and redstone to get all the dispensers wired up. While I could have used Ender IO redstone conduit, I have found in the past that the stuff is incredibly unreliable and has difficulty interfacing with just about anything not from Ender IO, so I decided to play it safe and just go old school with this. And just like that, it's ready to rumble. All I need to do is pipe in food and hook up a timer to the dispenser signal. Oh, and make 7 more of them. Of course, those other pylon markers are not cosmetic. I need to do work on them. For those of you who are wondering when I will actually progress through the main tech line, don't worry. Here's a clip of me making a stack of IV tier motors just to show you I haven't forgotten. Oh, and it's raining the severed heads of my enemies again. I really wish I knew what caused this. Several hours later, the pylons are in, and I am ready to start running startup tests. With something like this that has so many delicately linked moving parts, I want to run checks on basically every step of the process to make sure I didn't bork the wiring up. Once it's running, it will be nearly impossible to tell if I'm losing efficiency anywhere, so this is the one time where I can get it right. The first test is making sure all the sparks can see the mana enchanter and my monitoring pool in the center. In addition to allowing me to do mana crafting at speeds high enough to cause a Doppler shift on the moon, this pool also is going to serve as my barometer for monitoring mana output during the startup cycle. Since everything looks good with that, the next step is to partially load the system with stuffed eggplant. I don't have nearly enough stuffed eggplant to fill the entire system, since this thing can hold like 150,000 items when loaded fully, but I can set up the item import to round robin, which should ensure that everyone gets enough for a taste. By slotting in the barrel of eggplant, my system should now be partially but evenly loaded. After that's in, the next step is triggering each of the 4 pylon rows in sequence and checking how much is output. Each row of pylons contains 64 Gormies that have never eaten stuffed eggplant before, so their total mana output should be enough to make somewhere around 135 mana steel ingots. If that number is a little low, that tells me my dispenser network did not properly fill, which most likely means I missed a conduit connection somewhere. Happily enough, all of my mana steel counts check out, which means that all my connections are good. I can also tell by the sound of my headphones dying and recovering that all of the mana spreaders are stopping and starting at the same time, which means all of my Gormies are eating their own food, and all of them are correctly linked on a 1-to-1 basis with the spreaders. With all those green lights showing across the board, it's full speed ahead on getting the timing set up. After letting the farm run a bit to get the Gormies down to their diminishing return value for mana production, which should be the 4,000 mana that I mentioned earlier, I start dialing in the timer. It looks like I'm going to be dropping food for them every 11 seconds, though that number may need to get bumped down a bit if there's more return to diminish on. Regardless, this is the mana generation part of the system, so that problem is done. This system running on full tilt will charge a Terra Shatterer in 3.2 hours. That is how you're supposed to do Britannia, folks. Of course, I am far from out of the woods just yet. With 256 Gormies consuming stuffed eggplant every 11 seconds, I need to be supplying the mana generator something like 25 stuffed eggplants per second. Can we just pause and reflect on the fact that I am unironically using stuffed eggplants per second as a unit of measure? That is a thing that I am doing. Anyway, that is a very stinking large amount of stuffed eggplant that I am not making at the moment. Fortunately for me, the Ender IO farming station absolutely loses its when you give it a hoe with an even marginally decent level of fortune. Like, say, fortune 20. No idea why nobody else does this. Oh, right, it's because you can't put Fortune on a hoe in this version, and Maddox just happened to cheat. Right. I did my due diligence, but I was not able to figuring out a way of getting around the unfortunate hoe problem. With no way to scale up the farm's efficiency, I'm instead stuck with scaling the farm's infrastructure. I have no idea how many farms I will need to supply 25 something or other stuffed eggplants per second, but it looks like Ender.io farmers harvest somewhere around 5 crops a second, and they get about 3 items from each successful harvest. If I assume that 3 of those harvest attempts work, then adding 2 more full Ender.io farms for garlic and eggplant ought to be enough to get me somewhere close to the number I need. Unlike many things in this mod pack, this is very much a horseshoes and hand grenades kind of thing, since I actually don't even need to make exactly 25 eggplants a second. I just need to make more than I already am. In the worst case scenario, I can just buffer the living daylights out of the inventory storage for the system and let it run overnight. 4 Ender.io farms require 4 juiced up Maddox, since there's really no point in using the things without the Maddox in them. Crafting the Maddox is easy. Leveling the Maddox up is a massive pain in the keister, and requires me to break a very substantial amount of dirt to get the 3 extra mod slots I need. Geez, I wonder where I'm going to get a very substantial amount of dirt from. Yeah, okay, no, that's a steaming lie. I absolutely know where I'm going to get the dirt from. I gotta say, I originally made this pocket dimension only so that I could get a cat, but the thing really does an excellent job at doubling as the world's most extra dirt creeper. And there we go. Fun fact, it only just dawned on me as I finished making these Maddox that I could have saved myself quite a lot of trouble and made the things out of unstable ingots. But hey, I needed 30,000 dirt for something anyway. Ethanol production. Yeah, I needed more ethylene for something. No, this was entirely just me being dumb and forgetting that I could make unbreakable tools out of unstable ingots. Whatever, I got the tool parts swapped out, the upgrades swapped in, crammed them into an overchanter, I'm good to go, forget about it. That little bit of stupidity out of the way, I got the farms in and wired up without any issues. Well, except for the obvious one. For some unfathomable reason, having almost 3 stacks of sprinklers running on an additional 4 farming plots seems to have done some deeply undesirable things to the frame rate. The game is not unplayable, exactly, but it is starting to reach the point where I am concerned about what's going to happen once I have the mana pylons all running in addition. Auto-crafting is solved easily enough by just doing more of it. These systems are really quite fast natively, and they tend to get a fair bit faster once you upgrade their speed 15 times. After cramming all that junk in, I run a pipe to the enchanting setup, get its logistics system working with the higher item throughput, and boy howdy, you can sure tell when the particle effects from the sprinklers stop rendering, can't you? Yeesh, those suckers chunk the frame rate. Fortunately, they don't seem to be super CPU intensive, so hopefully my world isn't getting, bogged down too much. And there we go. You could have just let me had my infinite mana exploit, Gregtech. I tried to do this the easy way, with viewers as my witness. You know I tried. You are the one who made me do this. All this lag and stupidly over-engineered nonsense, yeah, this is your fault. I am not quite ready, though. The over-enchanter is painfully slow, but also seems to be pretty stable when world accelerated, so I make myself an MV world accelerator and wire that in. This machine consumes quite a lot of amperage, but the voltage is low enough that it only translates to about 1 EV amp, so its power consumption is not terribly considerable. I just want to remember to turn it off when I'm done. To supply the system with Essentia, I salvage some bits from my Essentia management system and just run a cable over. I'm going to end up needing a substantial amount of Precanto to do all of the over-enchanting, but once I get started in the higher levels, mana enchanting is going to slow down enough that my poor overworked Essentia smeltery can catch up without many concerns at all. And now, after almost an entire episode of sufficiently automated and over-explained nonsense, it is finally time to go. Target set for looting 160, here I come. At looting 10, the mana enchantment system is still so powerful that the mana acquisition stage barely even has time to render the loading bar. Don't worry, that will change. By looting 20, the system has started to have to think before finishing its mana loading stage. It's still snappy, but you're starting to see that the thing is consuming mana at all. This does not last. By looting 40, some of the cracks in my design have already started to show through. Looting 40 takes about 25 mana pools to apply, and while that is within the ability of my system to supply in a few seconds, I am having to wait longer and longer between enchantments just so the system can recharge its mana bank, which is taking away a lot more time that I could be using for other things, like, progressing the game state. The solution, then, is to make a bigger mana bank. Much, much bigger. Because of how mana works in Botania, this is actually quite trivial. To get a bigger mana bank, I have to first shut down all of the mana pylons and reconfigure all the sparks in them with a recessive augment. This augment tells the spark to broadcast its mana in the pool out to all other non-augmented and dominant augmented sparks in range. With those upgrades installed, any mana pool with a regular spark in range of both the mana enchanter and one or more of my mana pylons can then be used to directly increase my managed storage capacity. And I can make a whole lot of mana pools. Specifically 512 more mana pools, bringing the total poolage to 576, and my frame rate down to just 6, optimistically. At 4,000 mana times 256 gourmets divided by 11 seconds, this system takes about 1.7 hours to charge to capacity now, which will let me do things other than babysit the mana enchanter for the next 4 days of my life. Which is a number that is much larger than the ideal estimate I made earlier entirely because I can't upgrade to Gaia spreaders. Needless to say, this is going to be one of those long-term projects that I put on the back burner. That said, this sucker really can crank through the enchanting process now. All these pools have the side effect of also speeding up the enchanting step by a whopping 900%, so I'm back to nice and snappy charging animations, interspersed with only an hour and a half of waiting. Which in turn frees me up to do other things, like actually pushing into IV, which is something that I have had the ability to do for almost 2 episodes now and have just ignored because I was too busy playing with side quests. Maybe I will start trying to beat the game or something in the next episode. No promises on that, but I am out of time for this one. Thank you for yours. Channel support through the usual methods down below is never expected, but is always welcome, and I hope you enjoyed.